So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the December 1st, 2021 meeting of the Board of Education Task Force for Prince George's County. My name is Erica Berry Wilson, and I work in the Office of the County Executive. I want to welcome our task force members along with the public who is viewing this meeting on YouTube to tonight's meeting. We're excited about tonight's meeting because we're really getting into the thick of the work that this task force was formed for. And we have a great guest presenter that the task force members will be hearing from regarding tonight's topics, which is the duties, roles, and responsibilities of a Board of Education. And so we want to make sure that we have Ms. Khanisha Williams, who you'll hear more about soon, give her undivided attention and really listen to some of the information she is providing for us so that we can make some very objective and informed decisions. The other thing I just want to inform, just some minor housekeeping, just a reminder that our public listening session is scheduled for next week, December 8th. We will be starting that session at 6 o'clock. I know normally our meetings start at 6:30, but next Wednesday, we will be starting at 6 o'clock. So we ask that you continue to share that opportunity with your network. If there is anyone who you know who may be interested in providing some insight and input about the school board and school governance. The sign-up process for that public listening session will close on at 5 o'clock on December 7th. So up until 5 o'clock on Tuesday of next week, people will have the opportunity to sign up to speak. If people do not want to speak, but they want to submit written comments, they also have that option as well. But we are inviting people to address the task force. Also, we have posted some additional information on the website. So hopefully you all have been able to visit the website from time to time. We've updated the member list with your subcommittee assignments. And many of you should have been contacted, or it's definitely our subcommittee lead should have been contacted by your county representative, your county staff person to start setting up those meetings. If you have not started hearing from your subcommittee lead, or you have not scheduled a meeting, please make sure that you reach out to your lead so that we can get those meetings on the calendar and again, we can get the work done. On that note, I will now give the meeting over to our chair of the task force, Dr. Sean Coleman.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're excited about this work. This evening, we will have a very brief summary of the Board of Education's roles and responsibilities, and then hear from our guest panelist or guest speaker, Ms. Khanisha Williams, picking her brain around what's happening around best practices for Board of Educations. How we'll run this is I'll provide a brief summary of the current roles and responsibilities for Prince George's Public Schools Board of Education. And then barring no questions around that work, it's coming from the document that we've all been provided, then we'll move straight into Ms. Williams' presentation. And then from there, we'll have an extensive Q&A session.
And one thing I do want to add, Dr. Coleman, thank you for that, is the presentations that you will see this evening. You will receive those presentations tomorrow, so you will get those PowerPoints, and there are some additional information that we will be providing as well. So be on the lookout for the additional handouts and resources for tomorrow regarding this issue tonight. Thank
you. So here I am sharing my screen. Am I okay here, Ms. Berry?
Yes, you are.
Okay,
and one thing I do want to add, Dr. Coleman, thank you for that, is
Okay, so let's do an overview of the current roles and responsibilities for the Board of Education. Just an overview. Much of this, if not all, we already know, right? There are 14 members of the BOE, or Board of Education, 9 elected, 4 appointed, and then 1 student member. Of the 9 elected, the 9 elected members hail from the various respective 9 school board districts. As it relates to the appointed members, 3 members are appointed by the County Executive Office. One of those members, of those 3, has expertise in education. Another one has expertise in business, finance, or higher education. The third is a successful administrator of a large business, nonprofit, or governmental entity. And then the fourth appointed member is a parent, actually, a parent of a student who was currently enrolled in the county, in the school system, excuse me, at the time of appointment. The main two purposes of the board is to raise the level of academic achievement and then to also raise the level of engagement with various stakeholders like parents, students, and other community entities. As a point of note with regard to powers, the Board of Education may not implement a policy or take any action that contradicts the day-to-day operations or management and oversights of fiscal affairs for the school system. Here, though, if there is an action that is that is contrary to the action of the CEO, then there needs to be a 2/3 vote, successful vote to approve that action. A small commercial break around our student member and its authorities. The student member, very interesting to me, is that they may vote in all matters before the board, except certain topic areas like student disciplinary matters, collective bargaining, etc., that you see here. The student member may not attend an executive session that relates to issues around special education, collective bargaining, unless there is prior affirmative vote to that end. We're going to walk down the board organization lane and talk about the officers. The chair of the Board of Education presides over all meetings, sign, authorize, and approve contracts and other documents on behalf of the board, and also may appoint committees. The vice chair performs all duties ordinarily assigned to the chair, however, in the absence of the chair. And the CEO serves as the secretary, treasurer, and executive officer of the board. There are other staff that temporarily join the board. The Board of Education may retain counsel to represent it in legal matters. And there is an annual audit, financial audit of the board's transactions, and that includes an auditor, professional auditor. Some additional roles and responsibilities. The Board of Education evaluates the CEO annually and does it on schedule. It's important to note that actions by individual board members members shall have no authority to compel action in the name of the Board of Education unless action has been previously approved by formal board resolution. As it relates to proclamations, the board may issue proclamations to recognize, honor, commemorate, or endorse individuals, groups, institution, movements, anniversaries, and other such events. And as it relates to management of bank accounts, the board may establish bank accounts, but they are only upon action by the Board of Education. The scheduled meetings for the board, the primary purpose is to receive information from the CEO and the public, adopt policies and take actions for the purpose of improving student achievement. And through this process, the board is charged to promote equity and educational achievement through the means of ethical, legal, and fiduciary standards that's also focused on student academic achievement. The board shall establish at least one citizens advisory committee to advise the board and to facilitate activities and programs in the schools. And these citizen advisory committees shall be appointed for a specific purpose and specific period. Now from here, I want to give opportunity for my great colleagues. Is there anything that you'd like to add, anything that I missed, anything that you'd like to go deeper into before I introduce our wonderful, esteemed colleague, Khanisha Williams? Pausing for wait time. And I'm going to move right on into introducing Miss Khanisha Williams, who is the Managing Director for Member Leadership and Equity Services for the National School Boards Association and has been involved in leadership and professional development work for over 25 years. She leads the organizational focus on school board leadership development initiatives that impact student achievement related to the NSBA's governance and management. Her bio goes on, my friends. Ms. Williams is a member of the American Society of Association and Executives, the Professional Convention Management Association, and she serves on the Visit Indianapolis Customer Advisory Board. There is so much more, but I would guess to say that probably the most important part of this bio is that Ms. Williams is the biggest fan and advocate for her two sons, Robert III and Julian. Ms. Williams, please, thank you so much for joining us this evening and fill in any gaps that I left out as by way of introduction.
First, I need to unmute. Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. I think you hit all of the high points, and the most important part indeed is that mom role to Robert and Julian. Robert is a college freshman at Howard University, and Julian is an 8th grader. And so right now, you know, pushing him toward that goal of moving on and getting ready for high school. And we're actually getting ready for a major football tournament as well. So lots going on. But the bio sounds like I'm really busy. And we are really busy at NSBA, especially around this framework of talking about school board leadership, and most importantly, how school boards, how boards of education ultimately impact student achievement. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize my boss, who is on the screen, Regina McCarter-Jacobs. We have worked together in a number of different capacities for, gosh, almost 20 years now, with Regina having served on the Prince George's County School Board, on the Maryland Association Boards of Education Board as president, and chair of the Council of Urban Boards of Education. And those are all worlds that I've touched, and we've crossed paths. And being a parent and a member of the community, you know, we've had flip sides of the coin where I've told Regina, okay, I'm not wearing my NSBA hat, but I'm coming to you as a community member to advocate or talk about this. And fortunately, when she came to NSBA, she was still speaking to me. So that's always a good thing. But it has been a real pleasure to collaborate, and then also to work with someone as we're developing resources, tools, really exploring how boards impact student achievement, to have someone who's led and walked the walk and talk the talk, and can really help us think about expectations that are realistic and manageable and appropriate for school board leadership, school board and superintendent leadership teams, all of those different elements there. So it's just a real pleasure. And I want to thank you all for having me. Now, if I can figure out how to share my screen, let's see. Okay, we can get into it. So what we're going to do, can everyone see the screen with the snapshot of, okay, just wanted to make sure I'd done that properly. We're going to do a quick sprint through the key work of school boards framework, and then also talk about improving student achievement, and also talk about boards committed to equitable outcomes for students. So I want to give a little bit of background on the key work of school boards. The key work of school boards was first imagined, or first created in 2000, right before the advent of the No Child Left Behind legislation. And it was really around helping boards think about their role and their work, and roles and responsibilities in terms of key actions where boards have power and authority, where they act corporately as a board, not as individuals, and how thinking about it with a systems thinking approach could help them be more effective in their work as school boards. Now, there's always the question, can a board really impact student achievement or impact student outcomes? There's research out there, but the world of research around that and the actual world of researchers committed to looking at how school boards impact student achievement could also probably fit on this screen. But the findings are, and I believe some documentation has been shared, the findings are that yes, boards can impact student achievement, student outcomes, really lead conversations with intentionality when they focus on certain things. And then we took that key work that was initially developed in 2000. The version of key work and the framework itself has been revised probably about 4 times now, most recently in 2020. And the revisions were really around, we took a national level approach. So what we did was we looked at different school boards associations across the country. And we said, okay, what are the common things that whether or not you are a school board member in Arizona, if you're a school board member in Maryland, if you're a school board member in Michigan, when you go and you are seeking professional development and networking and really trying to figure out how you can be most effective as a board, as a leadership team, what are the areas where there's a lot of conversation, concentration, where new school board members oriented around different actions, different things that boards do that impact student achievement. And we discovered that there were common key areas where you would see this showing up in professional development, in sessions at conference, in articles, in conversations in the hallway, and then really just in the work that boards do. And we found those to be these key work areas you see on the screen: vision, accountability, policy, community leadership or community engagement, and the relationships piece when you're talking about boards and superintendents. And at the heart of it all, at the heart of all those conversations is really this focus and commitment to student achievement. So the first key area that we really delve into and we found was the vision piece. And effective school boards establish a clear vision with high expectations for quality teaching and learning, and it supports strong student outcomes. It's clear and specific goals that move a district forward, and the vision is a very powerful driver in the big picture of the district's work. It includes mission, shared values and beliefs, and a strategic plan that's built on goals, priorities, and objectives. With that is really, an emphasis on clear focus and direction, that constancy of purpose piece. And it's really important to, when we talk about vision, we say, vision without action, vision without mission is hallucination. So it's really important to make sure that you are focused on these other elements that really push and drive that vision conversation. The next piece is accountability, and accountability is not a bad word, but when you look at elements of accountability, of course, the first focus is there's a strong focus on student outcomes, but what's tied to that is standards. You need a strong framework for assessing the quality of schools based on progress over time. It needs to go beyond just test scores. When we talk about student outcomes, we're not just talking about test scores. We're talking about citizenship. We're talking about safety, the needs of the whole child. And vague standards make it really hard to hold anyone accountable. When we talk about standards and making sure they're really intentional and clear, you've got to inspect what you expect. And so those standards need to be very clear, very deliberate, so that you know what you're looking for in the end, what it looks and feels like. Board members in their oversight role work with administrators to also make sure that your local standards within the district are clear and specific, that they meet state standards, that they meet national standards, and they may even exceed those state and national standards. More importantly, in this capacity, in this role, board members also need to be able to explain to the public what the district expects each child to be able to know and be able to do at each grade level. And when there's well-developed standards, you can see that in communities with parents and caregivers, and they really understand what's expected, and students can understand and see that as well. Tied to that accountability piece with the standards is also the assessment and analysis of data. And we'll delve into this a little bit more, especially when we're talking about the equity conversation, the equity piece, when we talk about assessment, use of data, and the alignment element in the accountability conversation. Okay, policy. And this is one where Regina always likes to say policy is a board's superpower. What policy does is it really is how a board exercises its power to serve students. It's how a board exercises the vision. Through policy, school boards establish a set of cohesive guidelines that can really transform vision into reality. Policies exist for a number of different reasons. Some are derived from legal precedents. They're mandated. There's federal and state statutes. However, policies can and should also reflect local values and principles that are designed to address local needs and what the board cares about and what the community cares about. So some of these are drafted as kind of preemptive guidance, but visionary board policy is also extremely important board work. These documents guide the direction of the district, provide tools that prompt prudent change, that align and change with the times, whether it's a technology policy, it could be a dress code policy. There are a number of different policies that boards are constantly reevaluating, changing, assessing, making sure they're working. And when they implement them, part of that cycle is doing an assessment just to make sure that intent and impact are aligned. It's extremely important. So cogent and articulate vision is critical because policies ultimately are tied to vision. I want to talk a little bit more about policy and regulations when we talk about roles and responsibilities, and where we're looking at the who, the what, the why. And so the way that we like to kind of break this out when we talk about roles and responsibilities as a leadership team element is with policies rest with the board. Guidelines and regulations are tied to policies, and that is the realm, that's the lane of the superintendent and staff. So when we talk about the kind of where in those two lanes where a board would be focused when it comes to policy, boards focus on the who, the what, the why. Whereas superintendent and staff are on that implementation side, they're focused on the how. A board would set goals, and then the superintendent side of the house supports and implements that board policy that's tied to the goal setting. The board's work is really around implementing, using policy to resolve issues. And on the superintendent side, the administrative side, providing direction for administrative decisions and district procedures. Again, going back up to that how. When the board is defining and aligning administrative responsibilities, the superintendent administrative side is really looking at how those definitions and responsibilities are aligned. And then when the board is looking at establishing oversight and evaluation procedures as they're tied to policy, the superintendent administrative side is looking at implementation and going back and giving feedback and data on policy effectiveness, whether or not policies are still timely, if they need to be revised or out of date, all of those different components there. So clearly the board's work is policy work. And if you look at those verbs that accompany it, it's really clear about those roles and responsibilities. They're not kind of fighting against each other, they're working together. So this rolls into this piece around governance team relationships. We always talk about it as a team. When Dr. Coleman was speaking earlier and talking about the overview of the Prince George's County Board and the role, the emphasis is really on team. He mentioned where no individual can act or make a decision on behalf of the entire board or speak as the board. The board is a full team, and so the team approach is essential. One of the most important relationships that the board as a whole must establish is with its superintendent. And that's setting the stage with norms, with establishing the ground rules and engagement around communication. It's around evaluation, both board self-evaluation, which can often lend a component of the superintendent evaluation or should be a part of the superintendent evaluation. But it's really around the relationship piece. A board can't be effective unless the superintendent is fulfilling their responsibilities. And conversely, a superintendent functions best, your CEO functions best, when the board develops a vision and establishes clear expectations and direction. So part of that productive partnership requires the board and superintendent as a team to draw on and respect backgrounds, responsibilities, abilities of everyone involved. Again, earlier when the composition of the board was defined, you saw these different various backgrounds, areas of expertise that can lend to some really valuable and a necessary conversation and give important perspective and lens to the approach coming into the community, who's at the table. So board members bring an understanding of the public's view. I have a colleague, one of my mentors, who always said, for a school board member, their office is aisle 4 at Safeway. It's pretty much, their approach. I see some heads nodding on that one, because they're really conveners of the community, and the community will come to you and find you if they need to, just to kind of either share a concern or provide an update, whatever it is. That's a huge piece. That's a huge role for school board members. And then when defining roles in writing, they can be as specific or general as you see fit, but specific policies around, norms, communication, the evaluation cycle are very helpful. It's good to leave a little room for administrative flexibility. It's good to give the administrators some flexibility also to take prudent risks, to allow opportunity for corrective action when mistakes are made. But, it's really around the norms and the relationships. It's really around being able to communicate, to really be able to establish kind of the culture of the board and to have that reflecting and setting a tone for how the district operates. And you've got communities watching. One thing is that people will come out to a school board meeting when they're really unhappy about something. You don't usually see people lined up when things are going great. And in working with colleagues across the country, we're always looking for great examples of boards operating and communicating and just having meetings and convening effectively. You can find a ton of examples of school board meetings that are less than ideal, school board meetings where things aren't working well. And so it's really important to show that these board superintendent relationships, these governance teams relationships can work and can work well, especially when roles and relationships are established and norms have been established. One other piece that's really important is the evaluation piece. The board should have its own self-evaluation cycle and schedule with different goals and touch points, as well as the superintendent evaluation. There should be some elements there when the board is saying, did we establish certain goals and did we set out and did we achieve what we set to achieve as a board, as a team this year? This slide just talks a little bit more about what you see, what outcomes are when there's effective governance teams at work. We talk again about high expectations and goals, the establishment of the vision, the establishment of priorities. One of the most important things I think to touch upon here is really around the pieces of training and professional development to improve governance practice. What we found in some of the research, especially around traits of effective boards, this is both in the Iowa Lighthouse study. I believe you may have some materials on that, as well as the Center for Public Education's 8 characteristics of effective boards, is that boards who learn together, boards who commit to treating this as professional practice or study, they approach it as a professional team, have better outcomes. So to engage in training and professional development to improve your governance practice, to think about how you can improve policy, or what your policy cycle looks like, or what your policy calendar looks like tied to the goals. That's really important. There are over 30 states right now who have mandated training of some sort. And that could be mandated training either from the state level, or it could be they've implemented their own policy about mandated training, or in some cases, it may be tied to state training as part of membership in their respective state school board association. And there are things that are tied to it, such as like maybe a master class designation by a state association for completing a certain body of training. But it's, it is very important. It's essential. I don't believe Maryland is a state where there's mandated training, but there is a wealth of training and professional development opportunities that are offered by MABE, for example, the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, everything from book studies to really deep and intensive leadership training to serve on the association board. Of course, National School Boards Association, we offer a number of different conferences, webinars, always coming out with a report or a study in that realm as well. But that's also just really important and really essential to learn together. It's to be a community of learners, to be a community always engaged in continuous improvement. So, we talk a lot about lanes. I'm going to shift and talk about levels a little bit too, just to really touch upon the balanced leadership role concept. And Virginia, I don't know if you want to add to this or speak to this as well, but when we look at it and you look at the governance role, the school board role, the focus is strategic. That's that 50,000-foot view. For administrators, the role is tactical. If you think about that chart that we had before with the who, the what, the why, the how, this aligns to it in a different way. That's the 10,000-foot view. Then you've got your operational leadership that's on the ground, in the classroom, in the building, the implementation focus. That is the close-up view. But if you're at the 50,000-foot view on the mountaintop, you can't be in the weeds. And so I think that is one of the most important. It's easy to get to be in the weeds. It's easy to get in those weeds. But, if you're really focused on the strategic excellence at that 50,000-foot view, that is the appropriate level or lane for boards. Regina, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or if you want me to keep going.
No, you can keep going, Khanisha.
One other analogy, because I like analogies, I like, to put that picture in mind. I have some colleagues in Illinois. I think they were one of the first associations to liken the role of the board to a balcony and a dance floor. So if school boards are on the balcony and they may be saying the next dance is going to be a waltz, or it's going to be a minuet, or it's going to be the cha-cha, whatever. They're not on the dance floor actually doing the cha-cha. They may say what the next song is. At that administrative side, that's the band playing the music, but setting the tone, making sure it happens, being tactical. But you can't direct from the dance floor. You have to direct from the balcony. So that's just another analogy. If you have allergies and you don't want to talk about being in the weeds, you can talk about balcony and dance floor. So is there any difference or extra magic needed when boards are also trying to be especially committed to ensuring equitable outcomes? No. This really comes down to intentionality, and I think understanding some of the nuances when you're talking about policy and when you're talking about standards, when you're talking about looking at how you are being accountable in terms of allocating resources. All of those different things. It's just about how you're leading those conversations. So we often talk about this in terms of using a data equity lens. And, when I was talking about accountability, I touched upon the data analysis piece, inspecting what you expect, digging a little deeper to collect that data, and really asking some questions to get under the surface. And then, in that too, is making sure you understand the nuances, the differences between an achievement gap and an opportunity gap. So we have these definitions from Ed Week and the Schott Foundation. The two can be, they can impact each other, but really when you talk about the achievement gap, it refers to a disparity in academic performance between groups of students. It shows up in your grades, in your test scores, course selection, dropout rates, college completion rates, those measures of success that everyone looks for and asks about. But sometimes people aren't really thinking about the opportunity gap, what it took to make those things happen, or how do you get there? That's the disparity in access. So you're talking about access to quality schools, resources for all children to be academically successful. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about this one. I know this is a kind of a passion area for Virginia, maybe we'll just go into some of those drivers of equity too, because that also really pushes and talks about achievement gap pieces as well as opportunity gap pieces. We'll just go on. Okay, so main drivers of equity. So NSBA CPE, the Center for Public Education, conducted research that identified 5 key policy drivers that really impact student learning the most. So when you, and those 5 key drivers were funding, safe and supportive school climates, high-level curriculum, meaningful community engagement, and effective educators. When you think about those main categories that policies address and how they drive equity, think about the different other educational needs that are distributed unequally to students sometimes. Things like access to technology, quality facilities, enrichment activities. But these 5 really rise to the top, and those other elements are kind of embedded in there. But these 5 rise to the top for their impact on student learning. And so with these, there are questions that boards can always ask when you're focused on equitable outcomes. You may ask questions like, who's receiving funding? And is that equitable between buildings, or is it need-based? How are you distributing the funding? Who has access to rigorous coursework? How's that determined? Who has access to the most effective teachers? And where are the most experienced teachers placed? How are they placed? What are the key factors to ensuring safe and supportive school environments? How's the community engaged in that? Because community engagement is infused throughout all of these other drivers. You consider things like how the board and district administration involves parents. How are you involving businesses and other stakeholders to address the diverse need of students in the district? And what types of surveys are you conducting as a board, as a leadership team? How accessible are board members, and how responsive are they to the community? So the community engagement piece, you'll hear that when people are talking about funding, about safety, about the curriculum and access piece, how you're attracting, retaining effective educators, all of those different things. So, you know, that research is pivotal when you're thinking also about policy and those policy conversations. One way that we talk about this, and I think we actually may have liberally borrowed this from the MABE Association, from the Maryland Association, but really talking about making decisions through an equity lens. So asking questions for any policy, program, practice, decision, or action and to think about intent versus impact when you're doing it. So, you know, you might ask questions about how do you use data to support equity? What questions should be asked, of whom? And how do you use data to build solidarity and support for things? What happens if your data story is not flattering, if it's not a good data story? You have to ask questions when you're making decisions, you know, with equity in mind, about who are the underrepresented groups affected? What are the impacts on individuals in the groups? Does it worsen disparities, or does it produce other unintended consequences? You go back and you measure. How are you involving the community stakeholders? Are there any barriers that need to be can't think of what you do with a barrier. Are there barriers you need to get past? And how will negative impacts be mitigated? So when you're asking, those are questions that should be a part of creating policy, creating programs, thinking about a practice, decision, or action, whether it's to start or end a program. Again, it goes back to intent and impact. Okay, and because policy is a board superpower, we're going to come back and talk a little bit about policies are doing one of four of the following things all of the time, related to not just racial inequities, but I think equities or inequities in general. Policies are not neutral. They are either exacerbating, perpetuating, mitigating, or eliminating. I don't know, we should probably make up a little song about it or something, because it rhymes. But, you know, you have to ask essential questions about what action steps should be taken to intentionally embed equity in the system. And then you have to think about, if we know policy, especially in resource allocation, for example, is doing one of these things, which one do we want it to, what's the intent behind it? You have to ask, how do you lead for equity, and how do you secure external resources, supports, your fiscal and ideological support, and how do you empower other district leaders with intentionally looking at allocating resources, supports, writing policy, leveraging these different partnerships. But when you're talking about the policy piece, this is part of the policy review element in itself. You're thinking about, are you exacerbating an inequity when you think you're solving an issue? Are you perpetuating an inequity? Are you not solving the issue? Are you eliminating that inequity by changing some of the nuances there? So that's just another key point. I probably did not do this one justice. Regina, I know this is your favorite slide, but the policy piece is really where the power amongst the board rests. I just missed, okay. There will be a copy of the presentation that will be furnished to everyone, I think, after this, if it hasn't been in advance. And then I think at this point, we can open up for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ms. Williams. This is an extremely informative slide deck and subsequently presentation, so thank you. I do want to open the floor up to any questions from my good colleagues, but before I do that, Virginia, was there anything that you want to say, add, editorialize, anything?
The only thing I would say, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I would just, one, thank you, Khanisha. I think you did an awesome job with that. I think what we see across the country and what we really stress across the country is the intentionality of the board and how they have to be intentional in every action at that governance level. And so I see you brought this slide back up, but it's so critical that if boards don't have an established process where they are reviewing their policies and not only reviewing them, but really looking at what impact they're having on the district, that is where we tend to see the ineffectiveness of boards across many avenues. And I think the key point again is that boards have to be intentional in what they're doing in their work with the superintendent. So I'll just leave it at that, and happy to jump in if you need to for any questions that may be asked. Khanisha.
If I can just add, thank you, Virginia. If I can just add one more piece, especially when it comes around policy. Many state associations too, state school boards associations too, can suggest a policy review calendar because otherwise it can be extremely overwhelming. Policy manuals and policy guides are vast. And so, there is probably a kinder, gentler way to approach reviewing policy so that you're not touching upon every single thing that doesn't need review. And we found that many state school boards associations are extremely helpful in, providing kind of some guidelines on how throughout the year, having a policy review calendar can be extremely helpful in touching upon those things that may be aligned both to federal policies that have to be updated and changed so they can make recommendations there, as well as the state level policies that boards need to be mindful of and what that cycle looks like. And then maybe also share, because there is there's a network of policy services staff at almost every state association. They're constantly sharing resources and language too, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, whether it's looking at a policy around serving students who may be challenged with food insecurity, or dress code policies, or different policies that may be connected to something like hairstyles and the Crown Act. All of these different things to really help keep boards up to date and make sure that those policies have been developed, things are being done with that equity lens, but also getting some of the best ideas and best practices from across the country, and also things that have been developed by the state association that make sure they're already in compliance with whatever state mandates and things like that have been issued as well.
Thank you. We have two questions on the board so far. In order, David Harrington and then Bakua Owusu. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great presentation, by the way. Really, really good. Some of the best stuff on equity I've seen in quite a while. So very informative. I wonder how you balance, and I'd be interested in hearing from Virginia on this as well, given her experience on the school board. I wonder how you balance one being the politics of getting elected to the functionality of being almost like a business kind of board, right? Because what I got from the presentation, and I'm not saying that that can't happen, but there are dynamics of constituency pressures and what have you that may lend for one to try to be both at the dance floor level and at the orchestra level. Ms. Williams, to use your term, right? And so how do you sort of, what are the sort of mechanisms for orientation and accountability that allow for boards to be at the strategic level while still having great accountability to the everyday operations as it pertains to keeping in touch with their constituents? Either one, Ms. Williams or Virginia.
So I'll jump in. I can see Khanisha probably saying, I'm not going there. You do so very carefully. And what I mean by that is, I think those are the conversations that have to happen with constituents. For example, how often have you heard, oh, people don't really know what boards do? I think people have awakened in the last couple of years, especially with COVID, and said, oh my goodness, boards make really critical decisions. And, and so the way you do it is, one, you really have to educate the public. And I know that sounds really simple, but it really does matter. So when you get that call that says, hey, my kid was left at the bus stop 3 days in a row, what are you going to do about it? I voted for you. That's not the time to have the conversation of, well, that's not my role. That's the time to have the conversation and say, let me look into it and I'll get back to you. But what happens is, once boards are elected or appointed for that matter, but once they're elected, that the superintendent team also has to understand that the board has that community role. And that's why we talk a lot about governance teams more than we talk about superintendent's role vis-a-vis board's role. It's really about governance teams. So if the board and the superintendents have the relationship that they need to have, they have that conversation with them. What do I do when I'm in the grocery store on aisle 4 and I'm constantly being bombarded by the day-to-day things that are not in my lane or not part of my role, but people have expectations when they go to the ballot box? Those are real conversations that board and superintendents, we find, oftentimes don't have. And then they have to have that awakening of, we have to talk about these things, how are we going to address it? So here's some examples. That's why we created, at one time when we were on the board, we created, how do you navigate the system? And so that's where the board needs to have that sort of elevator speech of, this is what you do when you have these kinds of issues, so that citizens or residents start to learn how to navigate the system. And we shouldn't turn them away. We just need to explain to them what, how to get to certain levels. And then when they do that, because we do also have, parents who will say, I've gone through every part of the system and I'm still not getting anywhere. That's when boards and superintendents who have good relationships sit down and have that conversation. Listen, this parent has been complaining about this. I know it's not my role to, go solve this problem, but I really need you to step in and help. I need you to help me figure out how to do that. And so that really does require those relationships to develop, and understanding that the board has an advocacy role too, that's oftentimes not seen once they get elected. It's like, you just stay in your lane, and staying in your lane doesn't get problem solved. What gets problem solved is building those relationships, creating those norms, and creating the relationship within the board and superintendent team where you have a process by which these things get solved.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Pakua Awusu, and please help me pronounce your name correctly, because I don't want to keep beating it up if that's not correct.
It's Pakuya Owusu, but feel free to call me PK as well.
Okay, thank you, PK.
Sure. First place, great presentation. Thank you so much for that. You covered a lot of things on balance and providing, I guess, like checks and balances between like implementation and policy development. I'm curious, I know some school systems in the state have ombudsman offices that act like as a neutral party. Can you talk about the role of an ombudsman and like how that could be helpful in further ensuring that there's like a neutral party involved on issues that relate between like in a school system?
So I'll jump in. there are various roles that some districts have across the country in terms of having that sort of intermediary, if you will, to help navigate those things. What I will say to you is that it does not take away from parents and community still wanting to address, quote unquote, or touch their board member. And so it's we and even in Prince George's, we've tried that in different forms several times to have, whether it was parent liaisons in schools, or someone who would navigate between the board and superintendent issues and with the community. So what I would say is that we don't see that as much in best practices for boards. It provides an additional layer. It doesn't mean that it's not a good thing. I'm just saying that we don't see that as much across the country, because we really do stress how does the board and superintendent develop those norms and create systems within their structures. And that's one that could be created as long as it's not designed to, I guess the best way I would say it is as long as it's designed with intentionality, where there's a process where that person, who do they respond to? Who do they report to? How do they develop reports back to the board that these issues are being resolved? I know at one time we also created a process where you could assess how often are you getting complaints about transportation? How often are you getting complaints about implementation of IEPs? And then how do you build processes around those kinds of things? So I guess the way I would answer your question is to say that each district has to know what's best for them and their community. And if that's a process that a board and superintendent team believes will work for problem solving and dealing with those kinds of things, then they absolutely should explore that.
I think to add to that, what we see more across the country is a real emphasis on providing a great structure for community engagement, public commentary during board meetings, and having some really intentional structure there, whether it is amount of time allotted, expanding that time if we know that it's going to be a topic that will draw a lot of interest and a lot of commentary, and really setting parameters and stage for that conversation, but ensuring that there is an opportunity for engagement. Some examples where we saw that happening most recently that I can recall are around when Fairfax County started changing names of schools, and the process for public commentary and engagement was pretty extensive. It wasn't just a one-time board meeting. There were several opportunities and mechanisms for the community to come out and provide comment. And so we see a lot of that as a best practice. It does allow people to also feel more connected because they are having those conversations in front of their elected school board members, their school board members right then and there. And it allows for a little bit of exchange and dialogue there as well. Or, response at the appropriate level, whether it's to gather more data and then come back and report out, get more information, and to have mechanisms and information for that follow-up. But it does allow people to feel more seen and heard, I think, which is why we see that public commentary implementation with some great structure, more so than some of the other things, but in very huge complex systems, or for certain issues, that office may still be necessary. And I think there were a couple of hands.
Yeah, I have a list actually brewing, and I have
Okay.
Stu Rivera, and then Dr. Christie, and then Christian Rhodes.
Thank you. And thank you for that presentation, and Gina for your input. Always good. My question is in the same vein, and it has to do, and maybe it's doesn't even fit, but I'd like to address it. I'm a process person. It's all about how the public knows what's really going on, and the unbelievable effect that social media has on any one issue, whether it's a particular candidate or if it's a particular item or whatever it is. And have you, in your experience, both Gina and Ms. Williams, across this country, seen a system that has something that looks effective for the way that a school board and a school system actually communicates with the public? I think immediately of having a newsletter. I don't know who'd make it, but the idea of a newsletter with bullet points or whatever that can be distributed through the individual schools as one way to at least begin to reach everybody. You know, not everybody has computers and blah, blah, blah. So if you have any thoughts about that, that would be helpful.
I think some of the communication is really around, it should be reflective of the community. You know, I think Prince George's County schools, the system is so large that it would be difficult to have one newsletter that serves all. You know, but I do, you know, we do see a newsletter in the form of the television channel for the county. If people can log in, this YouTube live stream, for example. There are a number of different things now that I think where people can get that information quickly. You know, my next door conversations are always popping with different things about what's happening in the county, or when something's happening in a school, or, you know, questions about the county. It's pretty active. So, you know, I think it's getting a finger on the pulse. Maybe that's a survey question too, about how people would prefer to receive information. And you may see all those different modes expressed as a preference there. And you just have to figure out what's most efficient and effective.
I agree. Just to throw in there, Gina, as I worry about the disenfranchised families, the ones that are hiding in the corners that don't have access to this, they may not even know there is a school board and what that means and what it actually does. So I'm thinking of an entire community. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, what I was going to say is that we have to, it is the responsibility to understand that people have different needs. That's the equity conversation, and we can't continue to have school board governance roles and responsibilities conversations without acknowledging and realizing that when we still have a significant number of students in Prince George's County who live in conditions of poverty or meet certain conditions. And so we have to, we're not doing our jobs, if you will, if we're not meeting the variety of needs that students have. And so to answer, I think, part of your question too, it is having a system in place and norms in place. And again, as Khanisha said, particularly in a school district as large as ours, where we meet the needs of those parents and families. And it might look different in Forestville than it looks in Bowie. And we have to be okay with that. But the key, I think, is being intentional about doing that. And in some ways, it's a newsletter, but in other ways, you know, I used to tell parents, meet me at Panera Bread. I'm going to be there on X day at whatever time. And then I would bring those concerns back to the superintendent and say, this is what the group of parents explained to me or what they said to me. So there are a number of different ways that boards have to engage. And I know we're going to get more into this conversation later, so I don't want to get off on a tangent. I think what's important to note, though, is conversations we're having about time and place and how boards are able to effectively do their jobs and engage with the community when they're primarily, you know, showing up at board meetings and you don't see them, and that's the only time you really see them. So we have to really look at that.
Thank you. Dr. Christie, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. So Ms. Williams, thank you for your presentation. It brought forward some thoughts that I just want to kind of process through and think through with the group that really brought forward in my mind, which was, as you were talking about equity and, you know, mitigating and eliminating disparities, it really brought forward in my mind concepts such as community schools and equity learning hubs, which are two models that have, you know, research-backed success in that mitigating and eliminating disparities. But I think what was it, 2 weeks ago when we met last, I asked the question of what are some pain points that have occurred with our school board. And I think this really brings forward together to me that in these policies in particular, where do we differentiate between what should be the school board's policy, what is their role in terms of defining things such as community schools and equity learning hubs, and what goes into an administrative procedure? How do you differentiate between what is the school board's part in defining those things and what is the administration's part? How do you differentiate between what goes in policy and what goes in administrative procedure?
So a lot of times with that too, there is guidance around some of that language for both policy and the AP side that would come from policy services from a state school boards association. And, in working with kind of the work-alike group of people who do that across the country, if they don't have that answer, they'll go to the group and ask their peers in Montana and Michigan and Virginia about if they have an example that aligns both so that they can provide it. Ideally, when you're doing the policy piece, you're also trying to have that AP piece to come with it. That's kind of my short answer. Virginia, you might have more to expound on with that one.
I think what I would add to that is I think the key to what you're asking is, what did the board decide was what was the goals and strategic plan conversation at the beginning of the year, or whenever you're doing your strategic plan and visioning and goal setting? Because unfortunately, what happens is oftentimes we set policies and then I always say, is there accountability in your policy? Do you have an opportunity where you look back to say, is this happening? So let's use community schools as an example. Let's say you've developed the vision, mission, and the strategic planning goals has been set for the year. And then mid-year, someone says, hey, I think we need to develop a community schools policy. The question is that aligned with what is currently on track? And it is the board's role to be able to say, after looking at data and after intentionally allocating resources, we have established that these are our goals and this is where we are in the process of the year. So if you're looking at your data and the data is telling you that you're not meeting your goals and you're saying to the superintendent or CEO, why aren't we meeting these goals, or what else can we do to get there? Those are conversations that have to be had, not just sort of haphazardly, if you will, but they have to be aligned with the current conversations. So if you develop a work plan at the beginning of the school year or however you develop your schedule, and you have built-in student achievement board meetings where you're actually talking about these things, not just sort of haphazardly, they should happen organically. It should come up organically that we have a community that's still struggling, even though we put these kinds of things in place. What are the alternatives that we can implement? And again, sure, the school board can say, Madam Superintendent, Mr. Superintendent, here's the data, here's what you've shown us. We haven't seen the progress that you told us we would see. We would like for you to go back and assess X, Y, and Z and bring it back to us. And so I think that's where sometimes the friction, if you will, occurs, is how it happens. And remember that chart where we talked about the board talks about the what, and the superintendent and that team talks about the how. And so I hope that answers a little bit of your question. I'm not saying that boards can't do that. It just shouldn't happen in isolation.
I think I'm hoping maybe as a task force or something, we can have this conversation to help clarify for the school board and for the administration what is the role of the school board in defining a policy such as community schools. And if you see that the administration is not implementing your vision, the vision that the school board has, is that then a place where if you said, policy is the superpower of the school board, and a school board sees the administration isn't doing implementation the way their vision foresaw it, do they then go back and strengthen the policy to more clearly define, to maybe force that issue of that implementation the way to fulfill their vision?
Yeah, it is the board. I'll just say this final piece. I think the board, that piece about accountability is so important. So, you know, oftentimes the board is the one getting beat up when it's saying, it's saying, let the superintendent do the day-to-day, because that's what the superintendent does. But superintendents don't use our research. Superintendents usually aren't leaving districts because of student outcomes, which says something. If you continue to have student outcomes that are not where you need it to be, superintendents really aren't leaving districts because of that. They're leaving districts because of conduct issues or some other things related to, but they're rarely leaving because they didn't meet the goals around student outcomes. That also means the board may not be holding the system accountable the way it should. So, but that's something that you have to assess through, again, looking at your data, being intentional about allocating resources. The final example I would give you is one that we tell boards: if you get your budget process every year, and you've established a process where the data is driving decision-making, and not just data, but obviously the whole child and what that means, and you get a budget that isn't aligned with the needs of the district, why are you approving it? So the board has three main things across the country, and that is to hire the superintendent, approve a budget, and establish policy. And those three things must be intentional. And so, don't approve a budget that doesn't have a community school concept if that's in fact what the data has shown you is needed in a particular part of the community.
Thank you. Mr. Rhodes, did you have a question? I see Mr. Gresham. And I'm not sure, is Rosa Smith, Ms. Smith, your hand popped in and out, but it's not up.
Yes, I have a quick question.
Before you go, Mr. Gresham, Mr. Rhodes,
okay,
do you have a question? No, it's okay.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure, can you all hear me? All right, I just want to make sure this is the right place. I think Dr. Christie mentioned, maybe, I think Virginia, you may have mentioned this as well, that there might be an additional space for more kind of conversation. This is not, it's one, acknowledgement of a great presentation. And then secondly, I think I have some thoughts about what was said, and I want to just make sure this is the right space for that. If not, then I can just wait till later in the conversation.
You have the floor.
Okay, I'll take it. I'll dance, as Ms. Williams used as her analogy. Cha-cha slide is my preference. Just 2 points. One, I think there was I think PK, you mentioned the role of an ombudsman, and I think Ms. Jacobs stated, and I think Ms. Barry Wilson knows that we had an ombudsman for several years. There was a lot of discussion about who the ombudsman reported to, and whether it was just a passing of the buck for accountability of the challenges or issues that the community felt. But that's a separate piece. I do think, just for comment's sake, that I think there's a level of shared accountability that I think is really important. And the presentation talked about it. As much as it was separated into different columns, the function, I look at the entire slide, speaks to the role of the board and the role of the CEO, superintendent. Ms. Jacobs said it consistently. I want to make sure I just double click on her points around the communication and the relationship between an effective board and an effective CEO or superintendent ultimately will drive an effective district. And I do put as a parking lot item for future conversation around just what does that look like? What are the examples across the country where, universally or generally AASA and NSBA and NEA and AFT, everybody agrees these are the spots you look at when you want to see success. And then lastly, on the policy piece, Dr. Christie, you mentioned community schools and equity learning hubs. And I think an area that I've always struggled with, whether I worked for the union or county executive or the superintendent, was, what is the how and the what? And I use this as an example for community schools, because some could say that it's a what, the what, and then some would say that's a how. Like, how do we address, schools that have the whole child in schools that have, that are low income, or students that are receiving free and reduced meals? What are the wraparound services that we want to provide? Some could say that's a what, and that's a CEO, that's a board's job, or some could say that's a how, and that's a superintendent's job. And I do struggle with that tension, because I think at times, because that line is not clearly defined, lanes are blurred, and there are, people on both sides saying, you want me to fix academic achievement, go, and the research says community schools is one of those elements. Well, the implementation is on the CEO versus a board saying, no, 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 the research says community schools is the most effective way. So we want to make a policy that says every single school in the county has to have one. So that balance, I think, is important. But just comments. Thank you again for the presentation. Look forward to kind of future discussions. I broke my rule. I promised not to speak at all at any of these meetings, and then I said something. So I'm gonna go.
It was a good presentation. Thank you, Mr. Rose. Mr. Gresham, thank you for being so patient.
I don't want to belabor it, the point too long, but first of all, I want to say great presentation, phenomenal. I think it covered a vast area of consideration. The one thing that I want to circle back, and I think that Sue asked this question about community engagement, because one of the things that that troubles me is that too many times things like this go in isolation. And we talked about that with community engagement also comes to the level of accountability. The thing that was mentioned, that Sue mentioned, the fact that what has been successful, and because both of the women who presented or tag team tonight, their focus is not just local, it's also global. And one of the things that interests me is what have they seen work in other areas that were successful with creating more or more intense, more intentional. We all know that hot topics bring out people or create the engagement, but what is it that we can do on a regular basis, or what have we seen in other areas or other school districts or whatever that has created the community engagement, which also brings that level of accountability? I'm really curious about that. Thank you so very much for allowing me to ask the question. Thank you.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that we've seen, and I hate to sound like we're just kind of repeating ourselves, but where the relationships and the communication, and oftentimes, in my opinion, this should actually happen when a superintendent is hired or brought in. And when new board members come on, there should be a comprehensive orientation process where you talk about, what the current state of the district is. But what we find across the country is that where the board and superintendents, they don't have to be best friends, but where they develop relationships and processes. So I'll give you an example. Superintendents who are, we often say that hungry boards will eat you for lunch, dinner, and breakfast. So feed your boards. Where boards are fed, they are out of the weeds. Where boards are fed, they're not in the day-to-day activities. And what I mean by that is superintendents that have, and we work very closely with, I do a whole session with the Urban Superintendents Academy with AASA. And where superintendents develop a relationship with their boards, where they're in regular communication with them, keeping them informed with what's going on, that helps boards inform their communities. And where they have systems in place where the system is designed to help boards inform their communities, it makes it so much easier for everyone. And we also say this, we tell superintendents, now Prince George's is a little different right now, but we tell superintendents, the boards that hired you are the boards that are going to love you forever. So don't make these really critical, I'm just going to say it, if you're making really controversial, critical decisions, when the politics are in a particular place, it's not going to be easy for the community. We have to make our decisions in a way that helps the community understand what needs to happen. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to make decisions that the community always agrees with. And I will go back to what something Christian said, the lines are blurred, but we shouldn't believe or feel that because the lines are blurred, that there's a problem. Blurred lines just means you need to have a conversation. It means you need to have processes in place. So superintendents that regularly talk to their board members, understand what their specific community needs are, and then try to find ways in which to address those needs are going to have less engagement by the board in their day-to-day activities. So what we see across the country, just quite frankly, is that board and superintendent relationship drives everything. And it's not like your corporate board, it's different. You're talking about, school boards have one issue, and that one issue is student outcomes. But what folds into that one issue is transportation and feeding and all these community type things that impact how a child learns. And so when boards and superintendents are in tune with what's in those backpacks, how children show up, then they're in tune with their communities. And so, again, I would just say that I think there's no magic wand to it, but where we've seen, superintendents that have regular conversations with their boards, they have scheduled meetings with their board members within the realm of Open Meetings Act, but keep them informed and feed them, and is aware and understand that they also have this advocacy role, is when they work best together as a team.
Just to piggyback on that too, to stress again the learning together, really having an intentional and strategic approach, even, going to a conference as a team, really mapping out the sessions and the focus areas that you want the sessions that you want to attend and report back on. So we also see in those types of settings, maybe there's a team approach to learning in different conference tracks, and then there's a report out. And that's also prominent and done during maybe a school board meeting too, so that the community also sees the value of the board and superintendent learning together as a team, things that they want to bring back, that they want to implement, best practices that have the data and results that you aspire to. And we see a lot of that at NSBA. I work on the team that, for example, selects sessions to present at our annual conference. And quite often in the proposals, we'll see where someone said, I saw this program, or, we first explored this concept at NSBA, we implemented it, and now we're coming back to share our story of success. That's really rewarding to see. But, what we see in that is, again, that team approach of really learning together. It's not just, with some intentionality on the areas that you want to focus on, that you want to improve upon. And so you're looking for avenues where someone can show you, this is how we did it. And especially talking about the role of the board beyond being a rubber stamp or, the checkbook, but really, asking the questions that align those resources properly, that, to say, how do they relate to the standards? How do they relate to our goals? How do they relate to the vision ultimately?
Well, thank you. We are approaching our time. Is there a last or final question? Hi, Ms. Rosa Smith.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Again, kudos to a wonderful presentation. I wanted to focus on just briefly a couple of things: the board self-evaluation and the training, the professional training, and for the board. If you could elaborate a little bit, is in the 30s, Ms. Williams, you mentioned that there were 30 states that that have this mandated training, professional development. I'm a big component of learning every day, right? A lifetime learner. And so I think that in giving people the tools and the resources needed for them to do a great job, right? For them to do what they have to do. So is like money a concern? I know that in the last speaker, I know in a joking way, he had mentioned that it was something like $20,000 or $24,000. And so is that a concern with the professional development? And then in terms of the self-evaluation, what happens after a board member does a self-evaluation? Who is held accountable for that evaluation? Is there any conversation discussed between the superintendent and those evaluations and things like that. So just those two pieces. Thank you so much.
So I can speak a little bit back to the professional development and some of the mandated training. And then, I would ask Regina to add the color commentary there and experience. But so there are a number of different places where the professional development opportunities present themselves. Primarily, one of the lead and recognized places would be the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, MABE. Prince George's County Public Schools is a member of MABE, and there are a number of different professional development opportunities that are there, either team approach conferences. They will also share webinars that may come through NSBA or other programs. There's a wealth of different of offerings from other educational organizations as well, NSBA being one of them, where sometimes the approaches, maybe it may not be the entire team, maybe there's a rotating schedule of leaders, so it's a smaller team that attends, a conference, or maybe each board member is, there may be a situation where they say you get 2 conferences a year, and then the rest, you find free resources or reach out, but through other networks as well. So, there's a number of different avenues for that professional development, even if it's not mandated, or if you're looking for topics, especially if you're interested in more around what some of those resources would be. I'd be happy to follow up with some of those different avenues. But I think the MABE website, they've got their calendar of different things, and it can be around looking at policy. It can be around the community engagement piece. There are different toolkits and resources that can also be pulled. So those are the pieces around the professional development element. The other question that you asked around self-evaluation, there are some self-evaluation resources that have also already been developed. And typically what you'll see is different self-evaluation tools, and then maybe there's a facilitated conversation about the feedback that comes from that self-evaluation. In a longer version of the key work, we have a whole cycle, and part of that evaluation cycle with the superintendent does include a board self-evaluation piece, because it should be tied to conversations around the superintendent as part of your entire cycle, where, at the same time, goals and standards and things that are set for the superintendent also need to be set for the board. And so it allows for some dialogue and conversation to say, well, maybe if the superintendent didn't meet a goal, maybe it's tied to the board also maybe not being able to make something happen. And that could be, one of the drivers there. So we see the mechanism for self-evaluation used in a number of ways. Primarily, one of them is just allowing some great conversation and the ability to see maybe different perspectives amongst fellow board members about where you are or where you think you are. It's always surprising to see when everyone thinks they're going in one direction, and you have made 1 or 2 members who are in the same meetings in the same room on that same Zoom screen, and they're seeing something completely different. And you get, but you set aside time to have that conversation to see if you can get back in alignment.
I would just quickly add that I think on your question about training and funds, it's unfortunate, but we do see boards across the country who desperately need professional development, and they are terrified from a political perspective to go to a conference or to attend a session. We do try to offer as many free webinars as we can for those situations, but that is a real thing for boards. Oftentimes when you're developing the budget, the board professional development is not something included there. So they usually have to try to, make sure they're their wishes are made known when the superintendent is developing that budget to present to them in the public. So that is a real thing. The only other thing I would add regarding the board self-evaluation is that the board has to commit to being held accountable. And so if you commit to doing a board self-evaluation, that also means that before it's done, because once the data comes out, you might backtrack on it. But before it's done, the commitment has to be that you're going to have a facilitated conversation, and that facilitated conversation will lead to how do you follow up on where, in terms of the accountability piece that you asked about, how does the board then sort of police itself, if you will, for lack of a better characterization. But that usually comes when the board, in its initial phases of developing the evaluation and agreeing to do the evaluation, the accountability piece is built into it. And then there's a plan that's developed as to how the board then meet its goals.
Thank you for your responses. Mrs. Williams, thank you again for joining us tonight. Thank you not just for joining us, but for your work in the field. I want to also give a special thanks to our good colleague, Virginia Mercado-Jacobs, for for co-piloting, co-pilot this venture for tonight, and for your seasoned and senior practitioner perspectives. So with that, and a huge thank you on behalf of all of us, I want to hand it over to you, Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Again, as extending our appreciation to Ms. Williams and Ms. Mercado-Jacobs on your additional input this evening. Hopefully the information that's been provided to our task force members has been very helpful and will help them to have more discussion and insight into how we move forward with making sure we have the best governance structure in place for our students here in Prince George's County. Again, I just want to remind everyone that our meeting next week is the public listening session, and we will start at 6 p.m. instead of 6:30 p.m. So please make note of that. We will send out that information as well, but it is at 6 p.m. And people will be able to sign up to participate in that public listening session until 5 p.m. on December 7th. We have been sending out information about how to sign up via social media and some of the other outlets that the county executive has, but please feel free to share that information with your network as well, because we do want to make sure that we're hearing from the public about what their wishes and insights may be with regard to our school board of education. So on that note, again, we thank each and every one of you for your time this evening. With regard to the handouts, I just wanted to mention with regard to the handouts that you've seen this evening, you will receive those tomorrow, along with some additional resources that Ms. Williams and Ms. Jacobs have provided to us as well. And we hope, again, all of those things are helpful, but you will receive those tomorrow. Okay. Great. So everyone have a wonderful evening. And if we don't speak with you by the end of the week, have a great weekend as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you.